My name is Kaylee Martin, and I'm a historian at the National World War II Museum. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Kate Landdeck about her new book, The Women with Silver Wings. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm going to give you a second. She's got a great stream of photos that she's going to put up for us so we can see as we discuss the book today.
See if I can figure this out for us. There we go.
All right.
And this is just gonna roll. There's nothing specific, so it'll just roll for us.
All right, so enjoy the photos as we discuss. This is a wonderful new book that's just come out April 21st, something good for us to all read in this time. And just to do a quick introduction, Dr. Landdeck is an associate professor of history at Texas Women's University, which coincidentally, maybe not coincidentally, is home of the WASP archives. And this is a book that's very special for her, and I'm sure she's going to talk about her journey to getting this book to publication. So I want to start, something I'm always fascinated by is, how did you get started on this topic? You know, when did you learn about it? What hooked you in?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and thanks so much for having me and talking with me today. So I like to show this picture. It's so silly, but this is that moment in time where I met a WASP. I met Carol Bailey Bosca, and that's her with Curtis Pitts. And all the aviation people who might be on here know that Curtis Pitts designed one of the coolest airplanes ever, the Pitts Special. And I was at the Biplane Expo in Bartlesville, Oklahoma in June of 1993. I went by myself. I couldn't get any friends to go with. And somebody pointed out the fact that Curtis Pitts was in the shade of the hangar over there. And I'm like, well, I'll go say hello. And he introduced me to Carol as the champion of the 1951 aerobatic championship in his plane. And then I found out that she'd also flown B-26s in World War II. And I'd never heard of her, never heard of the WASP, never heard of any of them. And I thought, well, if I've never heard of them, you know, who else hasn't? And none of my friends had. And I just decided that was wrong. These were incredible women who did a lot of great flying during World War II. So I kind of set myself on a mission that's taken, 27 years to get here. But I've been studying them and telling their story ever since.
Oh, that's fantastic, and it's definitely a part of the war that a lot of our audience is interested in, but there's been very little good material out there. So your book is a welcome addition to the resources on this. And so these incredible women have clearly had an impact on your career, and you've spent, as you said, 27 years now working on the story. But has this passion influenced your career in other ways? Has it driven you to do new things?
Yeah, well, I think a number of things. I had the great advantage of spending a lot of time with them, and a lot of their sources were lost after the war. So I had a chance to do oral histories with them, which takes me down a whole nother path of training. I went to graduate school so I could learn how to do history the right way, and at the University of Tennessee, and learned how to do oral history, learned how to do those types of things. And the more I learned about these women, I wanted everybody to know about them. And I wanted to do good academic history and good academic work, which is why I went to graduate school and why I've worked so hard to get those sources right. But I also wanted the public to know about them. I wanted to my friends to know about them, everybody to know about them. So it really did shape my trajectory in my scholarship towards public history. So working with museums such as yours, or working on documentary films and that type of thing, giving talks at air shows, not just academic conferences, so that the people of the world could know who these women were, not just a small subset. So I've really, knowing these women and their story has helped me kind of try to find this balance between academic history and public history, and try to find a kind of a marriage between the two of them.
And I think you've really managed to do that with this book. It's one of the things that I know is a challenge is the personal stories, and how difficult it can be to put those together with the historical record. So, kind of in that vein, was there ever something, a story that you got that you had to corroborate that became very difficult? Was there anyone that stands out as something that maybe even became a fun challenge for you?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, and thank you for your kind words about the balance there. I think there were so many stories. I really tried to get that accuracy. And when you do oral histories, this is a challenge because people are remembering something they did 50 years ago. One story in particular that I think has kind of caught into the mainstream, that has been sensationalized, and I really worked hard to prove whether it was right or wrong, is the death of one of the WASP, Mabel Rawlinson. She died in Camp Davis. She was one of the first of the 38 women who died during the war. And I started hearing stories in the 1990s when I was starting my research about, oh, Mabel was shot down. She was towing targets and she was shot down, and oh, it was so awful, and they covered it up. And that's just not accurate. That is not true at all. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out who was telling the stories and where they were coming from. And they were all well-meaning people. Several WASP were telling me about this poor Mabel that was shot down. But I went and I started talking to the people who were actually there. I talked to Dora Dougherty Strother, who's in the book, and I talked to Lois Ziller, who was in the air that day. Dora was on the ground and Lois was in the air. And so I got their stories about, no, it was a training mission and we were all there and there were no guns, and the plane had problems. And so it's one of those where you find the official accident reports, but if it's a conspiracy theory, you've got to go beyond that and talk to people who are actually there. And so that's one of those stories that gets touted a lot and people talk about a lot, that I was able to do a lot of good research. And I always try to find the rule of three, find three good sources to prove that something was accurate. And maybe a new source will come and prove me wrong, but I've really tried hard to get that accuracy, just because there are so many rumors tied to these women and their stories.
Definitely. And I think one of those, maybe not a rumor, but one of the things that's misunderstood by a lot of people is the backstory of the WASP. And the U.S. Army Air Forces and even the women that led it viewed it as an experiment. Although I understand a lot of the WASP themselves wouldn't want to call themselves that.
Right.
But what were those early years like? How did they get to the point of the WASP as we know and love them today?
Right. I think that's a great question. And they were in the WASP existed for 2 years. From September of 42 to December of 1944, and those are the dates that they accept. And the whole program started with the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron with Nancy Love in September of 42, starting working for the Ferrying Division, bringing experienced women pilots in. And then at the same time, the Army Air Forces realized, 28 women wasn't enough to do this, and they wanted to do more. And so they started a track that would lead into the WAFs. They called it the Women's Ferrying Training Detachment. And Jacqueline Cochran ran that. And, it's come out in the last couple of years that, oh no, the WASP started in 43 and these were separate organizations. And they absolutely were not. The training detachment women would train and get a little bit more experience, and then they would flow right into the WAFs. So those first 3 classes of women who did the training graduated and joined the ferrying bases and joined the previous women who were flying, wore the gray-green uniform of the WAFs and ferried planes. The name of the group, of this collaborative group, where Jackie and Nancy worked together to make this project work. The name changes in the summer of 1943 to the Women Air Force Service Pilots, because the jobs that they had expanded. Where initially they were just going to be ferry pilots, by the summer of 43, they realized, the Army Air Forces realized they had an opportunity to see what else women could do. And so they They expanded to towing targets initially out at Camp Davis in North Carolina, and then doing all sorts of other jobs. So they realized that that ferrying squadron name was no longer accurate. So they expanded it to women's service pilots, which there were men who were service pilots for the Army Air Forces. They had an S on their wings for the service pilots. So they were taking something that already existed, calling them women's service pilots. And then I think they added Air Force in there to make it a nice acronym. General Arnold was all about the acronyms sounding right. He didn't want them to be WACs. He didn't want to, he wanted something that sounded nice. So I'm pretty sure he added that in. I haven't found the document to prove it yet, but so there, that's where the name change came, but it was all the same group, and the cooperation and collaboration was there from the beginning. So if you're going to say the dates of it, you got to say September 42 to December 44 to be accurate. Thanks for letting me clear that up.
I think those are the things that are really important to clear up, and it helps us to understand the story better. You mentioned wings, and that's one of the things that the book is titled The Women with Silver Wings. So can you give us the backstory? What's the significance of the silver wings?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think for, part of the reason the book is titled that is because so many of the WASPs that I talked to talked about the significance of the wings for them personally, that this was an incredible achievement. Many of them equated the day that they received their wings after they graduated or when they were flying to getting married or having a baby, that this was one of those moments in time in their lives that it was just so significant to them. And the women almost didn't have wings when those first group, that class 43W1 was going to graduate in Houston. There were no wings for them. And some of the people on the ground decided that was wrong, that these women had gone through the same training as the men and they deserved wings. So they called Jackie Cochran, who was at home, and her husband, Floyd Odlum, answered, one of the richest men in America. They said, Dee Dee Deaton is one of the ones who called him and said, the girls don't have wings. And he said, get them some wings, we'll pay for it. And so Jackie and her husband paid for the WASP wings for the first several classes until it got kind of figured out. So you can look, there's all sorts of sources online where the wings are different until you get to the 1944 classes. But those 1943 classes, they're all a little bit different as they went to different vendors and they, put their classes on them and different things. And they finally solidified in 1944. But those wings just meant so much to these women and symbolized that they were pilots, because that's what the pilots were. And so it just meant a lot. It separated them from the crowd.
Well, that's really wonderful. And the kind of ad hoc situation is indicative of so many things during the war. I know you mentioned several times in the book, even their uniforms. That were in the men's uniforms, and you can see in some of the photos, they're clearly too large for these ladies, but it was just part of what they had to work through at the time. And speaking of that, with men's gear, and there's a photo now, you can see them in the shearling flight jackets. Over 350,000 American women joined the WACs, the Waves, the SPARs, but the WASP never did get official military status. What was the reasoning behind that? What kind of transpired to prevent that?
Right. Well, I think that's a great question. So they were technically civilians. They were brought in as civilians. Part of that was the urgency with which they were brought into the program in the fall of 1942. They wanted the WASP. They wanted these women pilots, but they weren't sure how to do it. Civilian men were brought into the Army Air Forces. They could be brought in as civilians and be on probation for 90 days and then brought in as second lieutenants. And that was kind of the idea, that they would see what women could do. Nobody thought, could women actually do this? Could they really fly, these planes? And that's why they called it an experiment, to see if, could the girls do it, was kind of the attitude. And so they were brought in as civilians with the intention that they would be brought into the military properly. And then it became this kind of political challenge of how to do the paperwork. You know, do we bring them in under the Women's Army Corps? Do we bring them in as these service pilots like they did the men? How did we do this differently? And it ends up in the spring and summer of 1944, where they're gonna bring them in as a separate group, and they bring it before Congress in June of 1944, right after we go into Normandy. So the timing was horrible. But you had all throughout the spring of 1944 this growing campaign against the women. There were a group of male flight instructors who had been let go, who had been doing preliminary flight instructing for men who would go on and fly in the military. These men had been let go, and we hadn't had as many losses. We defeated the Luftwaffe essentially by then. The Japanese had fewer planes, so we didn't need as many pilots. So we didn't need these flight instructors. Now they're all draft deferred, and all of a sudden they aren't. And they look, and they've got skills as pilots, and they look and they see all these women flying airplanes, and they want to fly them instead. So these men talk to their congressmen and senators and say, why are these girls flying these planes when we should be? So it gets wrapped up in the women's bill to become part of the military. Gets wrapped up in this whole, kind of this gender challenge of, do we really let women take men's jobs? Are they taking the men's jobs? You add to that mix the fact that the bill comes up in June of 44, when we've invaded Normandy. The debate goes on throughout the month and is at the end of the session. And people were hopeful in the summer and fall of 1944. People thought we would be done by Christmas. And so the vote is made to not make them part of the military. It's a technical vote, right, to set the bill aside. There's another vote that could come up in the Senate that fall, but by September of 44, we've liberated Paris, we're moving forward. And the question is, do we need these women anymore? And it all goes back to not their skills, not their abilities as pilots, but whether women could have jobs when men wanted them. And the idea behind this program was that women were releasing men for other duty. And by the fall of 1944, there were some who thought that the women were instead replacing men. And that was just not socially acceptable. So just as we see after the war, and towards the end of the war, Rosie the Riveter gets kicked out of the factories and her good paying jobs because men are coming home from overseas, the WASP are among the first who are going to lose their jobs. And because they're in the way is a big part of it. That was a long answer.
Oh, but it's a sad ending for a group of women who did some incredible things. And you talked about people didn't know if women could do this. And it's almost hard to believe when you read the book and in the early parts, when one of the women, the things that the women did before the war in the 30s with all the stunt flying, and the one, forgive me, I can't remember her name, that did 10 days.
Yeah, Helen Richard. Yeah.
I'd never heard of that. And
yeah.
It's hard to know that these women did those things, but yet their skills as aviators can be put into question. Are they capable of flying a bomber? She stayed aloft for over 10 days.
Right.
But, that's unfortunately part of culture at the time and the mentality. So speaking to what the women were capable of doing or allowed to do, did any of the women ever talk to you about if they desired to go into combat, or were they just, so grateful to be able to prove themselves at all that, and then was it just so maybe far-fetched for the mentality at the time, or post-war in your interviews, did anyone ever bring that up?
I think that's a good question. And that's one of those places where I looked at what they talked about in their oral histories with me, 50 years after the war, and their letters and diaries that they wrote about at the time. And, to see where they stayed consistent there. I think a number of them women would have done whatever the country needed. They were very patriotic. They were very much for the war effort. Several of the women lost, husbands or brothers, and wanted to do their part to replace those men who were lost, or to bring those men home. So they would have done whatever was asked of them. I'm quite certain of that. And that kind of tone is in the letters and diaries that they're writing, that, they don't know what's going to be required, but they're willing to do whatever's necessary. When I interviewed them later, it was kind of a mixed bag. Some of them said, I never could have done combat. I couldn't have, done the things that needed to be done. They physically could have done it, but just emotionally didn't think they could. Where others, actually, Mickey Bright is there on the right in this picture, she said, she would have done it. She would have done, she could fly the airplane, and she would have done whatever needed to be done. And if her country had asked it of her, she would have done it. So none of them expected to be taken into combat, but I think most of them were ready to do it if they needed to.
They were definitely a brave and really unique group of women, and that really comes through in the book, the way that when you write about them and their stories. And you've mentioned they did some dangerous things, like towing targets for aerial gunnery, and that scares me senseless to think I'm going to go up and intentionally let someone shoot at me. But and you mentioned the kind of the controversy with whether or not one was shot down. Were many WASPs lost in their years of service?
38 women were killed during the war. None were shot down. I just want to say that definitively, none were shot down. But there were a few who did, when they were doing the tow targeting, whose planes did get shot. The guys didn't lead enough and things like that, but none of them were shot down. But the 38 who died, it was in a variety of accidents. Some are, Mabel Rawlinson is one example where the plane was just worn out. Especially in 1943, we don't have as many planes, and all the new planes are going where they need to go to the men in combat. And so those on the different training bases are sometimes a lot of worn out planes, and they're cannibalizing other planes to repair them. And so you do have a lot of malfunctions that took some of the women. Some were in training accidents, that had instructors on board, or something just went wrong. They stalled and couldn't get out of it, or something like that. So, it's a wide variety of accidents, just as the men had accidents domestically as well. The women's accident and rate was comparable to men doing the same jobs. And that's one of those statistics in my early study of the WASP I looked at. Were they any good? Everybody knew they were cool. I knew they were cool, but were they any good as pilots? And kind of wanted to get beyond the hype, and they were. The work that they did was comparable or better than the men who were doing the same jobs. So sadly, 38 were lost, but they did their jobs.
Well, you talked about their talents, and you recently published an article to our website about Theresa James.
Yeah.
And her saga, You'll Be Right Back, that turns into 30 days. And for our audience watching, if you haven't read it, I recommend you visit our website and read it. And so one of the things in there is she's given a P-51 that she's never flown, and said, okay, take it across the country. And she managed to do it. And it is where you are in awe of the capabilities of these women and how they could just adapt. And part of it was because they wanted to prove themselves, and they were willing to try so hard and work so hard to do that. And speaking of Theresa, we talk about when she delivers a P-47 named 10 Grant. It was the 10,000th one. And I thought it was really interesting how she left a note in the flight log to the pilot who would receive this plane and her address. And you say that a lot of the WASP did that, and they would actually get letters back from the pilots who received their planes. Did any of these correspondence become significant, or, is it something that they talked about much after the years, or did you just happen to find the letters? And
Right. Well, I think a number of them did, especially those ferry pilots who were going to be ferrying the planes and that they knew were going to go to combat overseas, that they would write little notes once in a while and get little notes back. I don't know of any that turned into, great romances or anything like that. But if anybody's out there and knows one of those stories, please let me know, because I'd love to hear about it. But I think it meant a lot to both the men and the ferry pilots to have that communication and to know kind of the story of what happened next.
It's definitely one of those neat little inside stories. Just want to ask, is there, obviously as we've uncovered, these women face a lot of challenges, but was there a particular challenge that the women faced that kind of really came above all other challenges that they met during the war? Or maybe post-war?
Yeah, I think they, during the war, they faced the challenge of knowing if they were doing the right thing. And, some of them had family. They all had at least one family member who supported them, either a mother or father or husband in some cases. But that idea that society didn't respect women who served in the military very well. And so that was a challenge of being respected and people knowing you're doing your part for the war effort. I think the fact that they were in this pseudo military situation, right? In training, they got demerits, they got confined to base, they ate at the officers club when they got out, they did all these things, they were saluted, but they had no military rank. When those 38 women were killed, they all got their families got a $250 civil service death benefit rather than a $10,000 military benefit. So that kind of balance between the two was a big part of it. I think post-war, in December of '44, when they were disbanded, the war was still ongoing. It was in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge when they're cut free, and this was very difficult for a lot of them. They were embarrassed, they were ashamed, they were confused, and so that when the war ends and everybody comes home, it's a big party. But halfway through, the war, you're released, tells everybody what you were doing wasn't important. And so I think that was really difficult for them to figure out what to do next. And a lot of these women felt guilty. They had all this training, and the government had spent a lot of money to get them qualified to fly these planes, and they had nothing to do with it now. So they tried to fly for China. They tried to go to China to fly. They tried to go to Brazil. The Brazilians were very open to them coming to fly for them if they brought their own plane, preferably a C-47. So that didn't work out for many of them. So it was just a lot of good challenges.
And actually, the image that we see right now brings us to, I think, a good point for us to kind of lead into the end of our discussion is post-war and the fight for these women to get recognition as veteran status. And these challenges have been ongoing even into recent years. Can you tell us a little bit about how they, what spurred this drive and how they were successful with that?
Yeah, so they were technically civilians, but by the 1970s, you've got the women's movement, you've got the civil rights movement, and you also, starting in the early 1970s, have the armed forces saying they're going to let, for the first time ever, American women fly military planes. And the women realized they'd been forgotten. It wasn't a conspiracy. Their stuff wasn't closed or hidden away. They were just forgotten, which I think is worse than anything else. So they determined to fix that and to be recognized as veterans. It was a huge grassroots effort. Theresa actually started in the 1960s with the fight, but the rest of the WASP got on board in the mid-1970s, and it was several years of them fighting and getting petitions signed. And that petition and the image, they had women who were sitting outside of this fancy new movie called Star Wars and getting people's signatures and things like that. And they were finally recognized as veterans in 1977. And then, the way the bill was written, it goes into this strange, they're veterans for the purposes of the Veterans Administration. So the women didn't get the GI Bill, they didn't get any of those things. but they were allowed to go to veterans hospitals. They were allowed to put a flag on their coffin. And that was really important to them and to their families to be able to do that. And then you can see they got the Congressional Gold Medal finally, and it was awarded in 2010, which was a great deal of fun. So they had a fun time.
And I know one of the kind of later battles was actually something that I remember reading about in the news recently, is to be able to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And I believe you had some involvement in that, or you were supporting them.
Yeah, so Elaine Harmon, she's actually just over President Obama's shoulder there. Elaine Harmon had always expected to go to Arlington. Several WASP had been buried there in the past. And when she died, her family was told WASP were no longer allowed because the way the bill was written, they were veterans for the purposes of the Veterans Administration, and the Army runs Arlington National Cemetery. And of course, Arlington's getting crowded and people are worried about it overflowing. And so they said no. And Elaine, who was a dear friend, she was actually my first oral history, and she was very smart and very kind, has a very stubborn and very smart family who is just fabulous. And they decided that's not going to work for us. And they worked very hard, and they worked with Martha McSally and others to get that changed. So I worked with McSally's office in writing the bill and working through the different language that they needed to use to make it accurate. And so that was a great privilege. And then I got to be at Arlington when Elaine was finally put to rest. So that was it was a great privilege to be a part of the story in that way, to play just a little part to help them get that final recognition.
And it's much deserved. So we're starting to get some audience questions. Our first one, Kathy wants to know, could you speak to the personal traits of the women?
Oh yeah, that's great. So that's these women, I feel very fortunate that I got to know so many of them over the years. And several years ago, one of their kids, Nancy Parrish, put together a little video where she interviewed each of the kids and said, tell me about your mother, tell me about your mother. And then she kind of spliced it all together for us at one of the reunions. And they all said, and it was so funny because they all said, oh, well, she's nice and this and that, but they all said, and she's independent, and she's independent, and she's independent, and stubborn. Independent and stubborn were the two most common words. And I would argue stubborn in a good way. Where once they decide to do something, they're going to do it. And they're very independent. They don't care so much. They care what other people think, but if you tell them no and they think they can do something, they're going to do it. So that is definitely the most common trait, is independence. They're also all very intelligent and have a very athletic, very fit group of women as well, but smart, intelligent, stubborn women.
I can, even just speaking with you, that's the word stubborn has come up when you've been talking about their efforts.
Stubborn in a good way, right?
Yes.
Stubborn in a good way.
In a way that brings about success.
Mm-hmm.
So Megan wants to know, has any of your research focused on the similarities and differences between the WASP and the Night Witches?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, the Night Witches were the Soviet women pilots. The Soviets were in such a different place than the Americans were during World War II. We weren't being invaded. We weren't, our cities weren't under siege. And so our women didn't need to do the same work. The WASP had great respect for those Russian women pilots. Several of the women actually in the early 1990s, once the Soviet Union opened up, actually went to Russia and met with a number of the pilots. There's a great book by one of the WASP, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but where she interviewed a number of the Russian women and put it together in a book. So the respect is there for sure. The Soviet women, of course, flew in combat and did some very serious work. I think a lot of the WASP, they didn't know about them during the war, obviously, but in the years since, looked at them and said, that could have been us if we'd had to do it. But they were all pretty grateful that they weren't. Yeah, so I do look at the Soviets a lot. It's not in the book, but yeah, really fascinating group of women for sure, who did a lot of very serious flying.
They were. Let's see. John wants to know, were there Navy WASP or an equivalent?
No, I think that's a great question. That's actually something that was talked about, is having the women fly for the Navy. One of the women, Betty Gillies, her husband worked for Grumman, and she actually, some of her friends did some test flying of their planes and things like that, but there was no official women doing that. There were women who flew on some Navy planes, but they weren't pilots in that sense. Of course, the Navy leads the way later in the 1970s with women pilots. So that's kind of an interesting next story. But during the war, there weren't women pilots in the Navy.
And Tom from Chicago says, realizing that the U.S. had about 1,100 women aviators in World War II, any idea on how many the United Kingdom RAF had?
Right. Well, so in England you have the Air Transport Auxiliary, and you have several hundred women who flew with the Air Transport Auxiliary. You actually have several American women who fly with the Air Transport Auxiliary. They have well over 200 women who are part of that Air Transport Auxiliary, and it was a support for the Royal Air Force rather than flying, combat or things like that. But the ATA was very important in supporting the war effort over there. They would ferry their planes from base to base, or different repairs that needed to be done. And they ended up actually flying across the channel all the way into France with some of the planes. So yeah, the women in England were pretty astounding too.
And Ed has asked, could you discuss Major Malachowski's role?
Nicole Malachowski was fabulous. She was the first female Thunderbird pilot later on. She actually came to the 2008 WASP reunion and got to know, she had met some of the WASP, but she came and was our banquet speaker. This was the last official WASP reunion. I was honored to be the chair of that reunion. And she came and gave us a talk, and a couple of the kids of the WASP started talking with her about, I think they need a Congressional Gold Medal, don't you? And she was stricken by the idea, and I believe was a White House fellow at the time, and worked her magic and worked very hard, and was a huge player in making that Congressional Gold Medal happen for the women. And of course, you can still find the gold medal ceremonies on C-SPAN, and Malachowski is a big part of those ceremonies as well. She's terrific.
No doubt they were, the WASP were an inspiration for her. Mm-hmm. Marjorie is asking, in the archives at TWU, what kinds of ephemera do you have regarding the WASP?
I'm glad you asked about that. So the WASP archives at Texas Women's University are really never ending. I started using those archives in 1996 when it had just started, and there was one collection of boxes, and today it goes on for thousands of boxes worth of materials. They have everything. They have resources that I need, whether it's oral histories that they've done over the years, or the letters and diaries and official documents of the WASP, pictures that they've donated, people have donated. But then they have uniforms and banners and shoes and purses and bags and trunks and anything you need. And one of the things that they do, because they're an archive, is they loan materials out to libraries or to museums. So if you're a museum and want to have an exhibit about the WASP, contact them and they'll loan you those materials. And then when you're done with that exhibit, you send it back. So they take great care of the materials of the WASP story. as well as more modern women aviators. They hold the women military aviators archives. They just have so much. It really is, if you're interested in doing more research about the WASP, that's the place to go. They have everything you could ever want.
I think that's fantastic that so much has been gathered in one place, because that's often a challenge, is where things end up. And it's really wonderful. I'm sure it's made you very happy over the years to have so much good material.
Yes, you know, what historian gets to live 7 minutes from their archive? Nobody.
Yeah, it's really incredible. So I think we have our last question here, and I'm sure it's one that a lot of us want to know. Are any of the WASPs still with us?
Yeah, they are. We've got about 32, I think, that are left. You know, we had 25,000 women applied, 1,830 went through training, and 1,102 wore those silver wings. And we're down to 32. Of course, they're all over 95 now. So it's one of those that they're pretty amazing women.
All right, we had one more question come in that we don't want to miss. Jay Harris wants to know if in your research you ever came across Loretta Foy. Shortly after I returned home from flying, he was in Vietnam. I started a helicopter CFI course using a much smaller helicopter. My first day I was introduced to this little old lady about 60 years old who I at first believed would not be able to teach me, a 22-year-old recent combat vet, anything. And come to find out, our person asking the questions has come to find out this was a WASP.
Right.
So he wants to know if you're familiar with Loretta.
I know of her. I didn't have a chance to meet her in person, but this is a similar story that I've heard from a lot of people, where they go to an airfield. It's like, who is this old lady trying to teach me something? And then they learn. And because a lot of the WASP after the war started to wanted to keep flying, and you know, some did right after the war, and then some came back to it in the 1970s after their kids were grown, and a number were flight instructors and different things like that. So it's always fun to meet one of their flight instructor kids down the road. They certainly taught them in a special way.
I can only imagine getting to learn from one of those ladies. So, all right, our final question for the day from Joyce. Why do you think it took so long for WASP and others to gain veteran status and benefits?
Right. I think that's a great question. You know, the WASP tried immediately after the war, you know, after the war ended, and there was a lot of pushback because the economy was not great in 1945, 1946, and, you know, worrying about the Cold War and all of those things. You know, one of the WASP, Caddy Landry, there was a picture of a plane doing a JATO takeoff. Caddy was in that plane. But Caddy Landry talked to me about this a lot, and she thought that they never would have gotten their benefits without the civil rights movement, without the changes that brought, without just the example that movement showed. And then the women's movement was part of that as well. I think part of it too, for the WASP themselves, one of the things that I thought I understood, but as I've gotten older, I understand even more, is, you know, by the time they're fighting for their recognition in the 1970s, they're in their late 40s and they're in their 50s, and their kids are grown, and they've got more time, and they've got perspective, because they can see that they've been forgotten, and they want to have those 38 women who died be remembered. You know, that's their biggest call is, you know, what about those 38? You know, they knew they weren't going to get anything. They knew they weren't going to get the GI Bill. It was too late for all of that. But they wanted to get, they wanted that flag on their coffin, and they wanted to not be forgotten. And I really think that timing in their personal life, you know, their personal ages, is partly why it took that long. You know, they were busy. You know, those of us Zooming with kids and things like, right, you're busy. But then they were at that kind of nostalgic age of their 50s, and all those things come together and make it happen when it happened.
And I think that your wonderful book is really going to add to that. And I just want to remind all of our audience watching, you can go to the museum's online store to order the book. And I want to thank you so much, Dr. Landdeck, for being here today and talking with us. We were hoping to have you on campus later today, but this has been a wonderful experience. And we hope to have you back. And to everyone that's been watching, thank you for your questions and thank you for joining us today. And I just want to remind everyone that this will be live on YouTube later. So if you missed something, go check it out. And thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Great job. Thank you.